how do we factor in the increasing degree of foreign sourcing when we're evaluating the potential cost of a system?
Mr. Congressman, the short answer is I'm not aware where it is, and so I don't work at that level. We'd have to get back to you on that. I don't know to what extent it works into the cost estimates. I defer to you if you have a better idea.
I would say that the trade-off should be made that it is cost-effective for the program. I am not aware of any of the root cause analyses that are looking at the cost growth. I am not aware of this being raised as one of the potential sources of cost growth. I just saw a report come through, and I will have to get you more details, but it addressed looking at, it may be the Buy American report that's due to you, but it talked about, yes, we make the trade-offs, but often we get in return something from the country, and they look at the overall economic effect. So I would have to get back to you on that. It is an issue that's raised. I am not aware of it being identified in, for example, the Nunn-McCurdy cost growth analysis. And we now have an organization, the Parker organization, that looks at root cause analysis. I'm not aware of that as being identified as a source of cost growth, but we can ask.
In the award process today, is there any factor, any ability to factor in the amount of supply sources coming from domestic sources versus foreign sources in the award process, or does it work inversely in that, to the extent that more foreign sourcing can lead to lower price, the existing award process effectively creates an incentive for more foreign sourcing? Is there any ability to give a bonus in the award process to companies that agree to do more domestic sourcing?
I don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that. I just don't have the facts. I'm sorry.
Mr. Roth? Well, I would appreciate you getting back to me on this subject. I think a one-year jump in waivers to the Buy America provisions of 450% is something that should concern every member of Congress, especially as we seek to grow jobs here in the United States. We're spending more and more of our taxpayer dollars within the Department of Defense budget overseas. I think that there's a very strong argument that that can lead to the increased cost of acquisition for many of these products as you create a source network that is much harder to track from the DoD perspective. And I would hope that we could have a conversation about this issue going forward, and we could talk about the reasons and the root causes for an increasing amount of work being done overseas, and to the extent to which that is part of the problem that we're seeing within the overall acquisition costs. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. We ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 days to submit additional questions for the record. You may choose, Mr. Murphy, to do just that. I think that's a good line of questioning along with that in the industrial base aspects of that. Any objection? No objection. We're not letting you off the hook, though. Those are written questions that are coming, but we do have a couple more questions. We'll do another round for those that are interested in that. Mr. Sullivan, I noticed one of the comments that the General Accountability Office has previously made, and you mentioned again in this report, is that the Department of Defense should work to balance its weapons systems portfolio with available funding. So my question to Mr. Roth is, what do you determine as available funding? Just whatever gets appropriated?
No, we clearly, in any given fiscal year, I mean, we operate within well-defined fiscal controls. I mean, we first and foremost, as we build the budgets, we work with whatever the current administration is to build a budget within the fiscal controls. They have in general fiscal controls across.
Who sets the fiscal controls?
Well, we work. It's worked collaboratively with the Office of Management and Budget, and ultimately the Office of Management and Budget, at the behest of the White House, sets those fiscal controls. Then, as you well know, the budgets come to the Congress, and it goes through the appropriations process.
I make the point because I'm parroting a little bit of what Secretary Gates said just the other day. This defense budget in this country has doubled in the last decade.
Yes, sir.
You know, things like 11 aircraft carrier units out there. The next country in competition with us has 1. It's $11 billion a year to build those. So my real wondering is, who determines what's available? We just keep building as long as we can get Congress to think it's a jobs program and keep appropriating, as Mr. Welch said on that. It goes back to Mr. Solomon's comment about leadership. Somebody's going to step forward, and I think Secretary Gates has been stepping forward. It's incumbent on Congress to kick in as well and start saying, we have the defense system that's so much larger than all of our allies and protagonists combined. At some point, what are the other needs of the country on that? And I don't think it comes into your level on that, but it does come into Congress and the executive office trying to decide what it is we're doing here in terms of that, and then looking at those programs that have some of the deficiencies you talked about here today and weeding out the ones that aren't really relevant to today's fighting systems and needs on that, and moving forward and getting rid of those that just aren't working and being done right. So your testimony on that has been helpful on that. How do you assess affordability of a new program, Mr. Roth, or Dr. Spruill, whichever? I mean, that's the other thing that they were talking about. You assess the affordability, and we know that's a little bit above your pay grade, and we've got responsibility for that with the White House. But how do you assess capabilities in the context of the overall Department of Defense spending?
Well, and as you may be aware, we actually go through a very systemic, structured process. As Mr. Sullivan alluded to, the planning, programming, budgeting, and evaluation, the so-called PBE process, where we first of all set up the strategic plan, and we take a look in terms of what are the threats out there, what are the requirements out there. I mean, what do you need to resource? Then we go into an extensive programming and budgeting process where we try to balance off the needs between the various and sundry mission areas that we have, and we look at where you can manage risk and where you don't want to take additional risk and those types of things. And so for better or worse, it's a fairly long, comprehensive, convoluted in many ways process where you take a look and saying, okay, what are my needs in the tactical air community? What are my needs, in the shipbuilding area? And within those fiscal controls, you try to get as balanced a program as you possibly can.
Well, exclusive of GAO's good work here, does the department itself have a system where somebody raises a red flag at some point and says what GAO has said well before they say it, that, hey, look, we've got a program that's way over schedule, way over budget, they're not following the protocols that we've set up in our own systems, they're certainly not following the laws that Congress passed, and let's start weeding these things out? Or do you wait for, it seems like we're waiting all the time for GAO to come out with a report and then reacting, but
no,
I hope that's not the case.
I think Dr. Spruill can answer in two terms. We have a very well-documented acquisition process as well. But in terms of resources, again, frankly, there's competition virtually every day of the week, so to speak, for resources. And so those programs that are underperforming, those programs that aren't meeting a need, frankly, are at risk against those programs.
Well, I wonder, I guess, because I don't see the decisions being made. I see the budget doubling. So it seems to me they're all competing with each other and they're all at risk. So what do? We throw a little more money, we keep them all going. I hope that's changing. I think the Secretary's indicated that he's got a mind to change, but if we don't, where does this thing go? $1 trillion by a couple of years from now?
Could I jump in on affordability? Because I really think it's important. I think that at least from the acquisition perspective, we try to do two things, and it is recent initiatives and processes. But when programs start at system development, when they're coming to their milestone B, the certifications that the Congress has laid out for us, we must say that it is affordable, okay? So we look at the entire program. And what we did last year, AT&L along with the comptroller and the CAPE folks, when we got to the program budget review, when we were developing the president's budget, we looked at all the programs that had come through the process and were new. We looked at, were they funded as the service committed? The service must commit to fund when they go through milestone B. Were they still funded like that in the program? If not, why not? And if not, were there changes that need to be made? So I think we are stepping down the affordability road, and it's clear from what the Secretary said, the budget will not continue to grow, and so we must make sure that we live within our means, and that means some programs will not get started. Some programs will have to, as demands change, will have to be terminated.
Well, the indulgence of Mr. Flake for 1 second, I think that's right as a statement, but then I look back at what the Secretary did. He basically made his recommendations with respect to the Army's combat systems program, and that was smart. It was about $87 billion on that. But all of a sudden we look up and there's the portfolio growing again. They're going to reintroduce it under new names, new size programs. So here we go again. There's the $47 billion cost growth on this. Mr. Sullivan, do you have any comment?
Well, in fact, that's a good point, because one of the things we're concerned with right now, and in fact, we testified at the Armed Services Committees on this, is that the brigade combat team, the initial increment, after all this acquisition reform and everything else, it looks like the Army has made a decision to commit to producing that increment before all the testing is complete. So that gave us great pause, and we testified to that. That was not a good signal to us.
And I would hope, Dr. Sewell, give you great cause. I mean, look, I'm expecting to find the F-22 back at this pace. I mean, if the decision is made, $87 billion, this is work, and you should be hopping all over that when it starts coming up as little animals along the way for a little bit of money, but the same darn thing over again.
But
without the right procedures in place and on top of that.
Yes, sir. The Army does have a need for the capability, and so we are trying to address it. We're trying to address it in an affordable way. I will have to go back and look in more detail, but it was clear that the FCS program was not started out under the recommendations or the policies that GAO recommends, but we still have to meet the need, and so there will be additional dollars spent in that area. Hopefully not anywhere near what we were talking about in FCS.
Well, is there any exercise where you look at the budget having doubled in the last several years in this defense budget, and you say, well, if that's a need, and we determine that we're going to kill the program, then bring it back to life, where else in the Department of Defense are we going to free up the money to do that? What else ought to die?
And that is what the Secretary has challenged us to do as we develop the budget.
It would be real nice if the challenge was you don't get the money for the new thing until we see something else fall off the table.
And that may be the case. And I don't know what will fall off the table between now and the next budget that comes over.
Well, hopefully it will fall off before we start spending the next amount of money for something else. Mr. Flake.
Just a statement to echo what's been said here. I mean, we're talking about rules and regulations to implement the process of acquisition, but it's new weapon systems or failure to get rid of old ones that really, I mean, we're talking on the margins here, all due respect. And it's not just this Defense Secretary who made these noises. The last one did as well. We heard the same things. Yeah, I get it again.
It was the same secretary. I was just teasing him on that.
No. I'm just saying the one before him, under the previous administration, we heard from Secretary Rumsfeld some of these same noises, but yet we've seen a doubling in the last couple of years, and that fault does not lie at your feet. Obviously, we've got to make some decisions here, but what the chairman said, I mean, when we decide we're going to kill these systems, we need to make sure that they remain so. Anyway, thanks.
Mr. Driehaus?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to follow up on this issue of competition, because one of the challenges that's faced by, I think, Armed Services and this committee, quite frankly, is access to information. Just yesterday, there was an article in the paper about the Department of Defense not giving access to certain documentation and estimates that are being made at the department for members of Congress to review. It's estimated that the alternate engine by the Department of Defense will need another $2.9 billion. What we're getting from the contractor is far, far less in terms of the estimate. It's difficult for us to make decisions in terms of authorization and appropriation when we know that the department isn't following its own guidelines in terms of waiving competition standards, when we know there hasn't been competition for major propulsion systems, and now we are being told by the department that this engaging in competition will cost us a tremendous amount of money, yet we don't have the documentation to show that. And we are supposed to just take at face value the department's assertion that we should put competition aside in major weapons acquisition when we know that's not the policy of the department overall. And so this is an ongoing challenge, I believe, for us to do our job in terms of oversight when it comes to costs of weapon systems if access to information is held up by the department itself. And Mr. Roth and whoever else, I'd like you to comment on that.
I'd have to look, I'm not familiar with the specific request for information. I'd have to look into it. I would argue if we have a case, we should make our case, and I don't have any basic fundamental problem with that. But in terms of your specific request for information, if I can, let's get back to you, because I'm not familiar with it.
And I'm not aware of it either. In fact, I thought we were sharing a lot, everything that the Congress had asked us on the Joint Strike Fighter. So I would have to just go back and ask.
The information that we received on that issue, it was difficult to get information, I think, mainly because the department took a position that was no longer part of the budget. So they didn't have the numbers for that. They had excluded it. But we worked with the program office a little bit. And the other thing is the Joint Strike Fighter program just went through a major shakeup. So all of the buys, the annual production buys and how they're going to buy the engines and everything changed quite a bit. So that was real shaky data as well. We eventually got what we thought we needed, but it was hard to get it.
Can you speak a little bit, Mr. Sullivan, about your own assessment of the Joint Strike Fighter and the competitive engine over time and what you see as we move forward in terms of the various scenarios that you've laid out in terms of cost savings over time?
Well, we've done studies for other committees at the House Armed Services and asked us to look at that, and we can't say with any authority at all. We don't forecast the future, but what we did do was make some assumptions based on historical data, which was, I think you referred to earlier, the F-15, F-16, when they infused competition into that. And given those assumptions, if we looked at what happened historically on that, we found that it was possible to achieve enough savings through the life cycle to get a return on the investment for the competitive engine.
And those savings occur because of the competition, and if there is a failure of the single engine, then obviously there's tremendous cost associated if you don't have that competitive engine.
The savings that we assumed were as a result of having competition, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just quickly note that for those of us that support the current policy and the administration's policy on a single source engine, we note that some of the costs are very hard to estimate at this time. To have two single source engines with all of the end use cost to the operators is hard to evaluate at this time, and but I think has real consequences for the ongoing defense budget. My question was just back to my line of questioning on the true cost of acquisition, a quick one to Mr. Sullivan. My contention is obviously that when we look at the cost of purchasing a weapons system or a product for the Defense Department that is has a heavy emphasis on foreign sourcing versus domestic sourcing, that there's a cost to that that is outside of the defense budget, that in the additional cost to the government of unemployment benefits, the lost revenue that comes with foreign jobs rather than domestic jobs, that the true cost of acquisition when you're looking at a product that is made in majority overseas is not seen within the confines of the defense budget. And so it's just a question, Mr. Sullivan, has GAO ever undertaken an estimate of the overall holistic cost to the government of the increased foreign sourcing within the DoD budget?
Congressman, I just don't even know the answer to that, but I can definitely take that back and get back to you on that, see if we do have anything along those lines.
To the extent that it has not been done, it seems like an analysis that is long overdue, and I'd appreciate a further conversation on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Sullivan, one of the recommendations that you made going forward, observations that you made, was that it might make sense to set some limits on a reasonable length of time for developing a system. How would that happen? How would that be done?
So some of the things that we don't press this hard because it's would be taken as somewhat arbitrary. But what we found when we did a lot of work in the commercial world and at some world-class technology firms is that they enforce a schedule. And they do it for a couple of reasons. Number one, it limits the amount of time that people have to change requirements and things like that. Number two, it gets products to market quicker before the world changes. It gives some people a piece of time that's more manageable. And in terms of the department, we think that it would be good to operate within what the department calls its future years defense plan, which is typically a 5 to 6 year plan, and fully fund the development of weapon systems in that plan. You know, typically what happens, you're talking earlier about why there's no control. A lot of times when programs are 10, 12 years long, the future years defense plan plans the first 5 or 6 years of them, and then things start happening outside of those years. So that would be a constraining mechanism too.
What happens, last year we moved to get rid of part of the intercontinental ballistic missile. The missile defense program was $188 million, not a big item by terms of defense budget, but an item that the Missile Defense Agency didn't want, so they wanted to see it cut. The Secretary wanted to see it cut. The White House wanted to see it cut. Everybody wanted to see it cut. And the argument in return for that was, oh, we've got all this money invested, and so some of it survived on that. So that my question was really, how do you avoid that? You're going to say, well, the program's done in 5 years, or it gets cut. At the end of 5 years, aren't we going to hear back from everybody, well, look at all the money you put in for 5 years, how can you just end this thing?
It's a good question. You know, I mean, that's why we move slowly with those kind of things. But if you keep the requirements in line with what is doable in a 5 year increment, which is what world-class firms do, you know, one of the
stop
key
it at that stage where it doesn't meet the requirement. That
you know, the F-16 was built that way, as I mentioned earlier. One of the key premises of all of this is that you have to separate technology development from product development. You can't be trying to invent technologies while you got the factory running. In essence, that's what the department has been doing for years. They've had F-22 was a technology product, and they had an entire army to feed in terms of factory going and suppliers going. So you just, it's all in the requirements setting, I think, is the
continue
answer.
to make that sin on missile defense, but we're going to do that over and over again. Is there any contemplation going on within the department about setting lengths of time, reasonable lengths of time on that? Is that something that's discussed?
It's been discussed more in the IT world than in the weapon systems world. However, I think the department is very aware of the need to keep, most of the development is within a 5 or 6 year period. There are some that are not. I'm not aware of, it would be more that would be set at the beginning of the program, but I'm not aware of, except in the IT area, talking about limiting the time before, say, 5 years, 3 years, whatever, before you try to lay out a reasonable program. Obviously, once you lay out the program, you should stick to the program.
Your point is well taken, though, on MDA, because MDA, as a presidential directive back whenever it was started, was given its own rules. And it's kind of like a technology development program writ large.
Well, it's the most ridiculous concept in the world, spiral development. Don't even started. That's a series of 100
I'm
hearings.
sorry, I didn't realize you were talking specifically about missile defense.
No, we were not. So your
Okay.
answer was fine,
Yeah.
but I think you make a good point. It's
Yeah.
a point on that. Is there a plan to deal with the situation on the software, and all of the additional lines that are always required on that? I see it noted by Mr. Sullivan. I think we all recognize it as a problem as well or anything, but I'm not sure how we get on top of that, or if you have any ideas the department does on what we're going to do about that.
Well, again, we would look to both the systems engineering folks, the new folks that we're bringing in as a result of WSARA, and the developmental testers to get a handle on it up front. It's a big issue for the independent cost estimators. They have developed databases, and they will bring in what they think is the best estimate. I'm not aware of any special emphasis. I know it's an important component, becoming a bigger component of most of the weapons systems, and therefore it requires a lot of attention, especially from the cost estimators and the scheduling folks.
Thank you. Mr. Flake? Mr. Driehaus?
I'll take one more shot, Mr. Chairman. You know, I want to continue this discussion about the Joint Strike Fighter and the competitive engine because it's important. It's one of the most expensive systems that we are funding right now. And by Pratt & Whitney's own estimate, the F-135, the design and development, has gone from $4.8 billion to $7.3 billion. That's without competition. We don't know what it will be next year or the year after that, or the potential increases. We have a major manufacturer coming in that we've already invested billions in for an alternative engine that's now coming through with a fixed price. So we know there won't be cost increases in the future. Yet the department is aggressively trying to kill the very competition that we know has worked in the F-15 and the F-16. We have already learned these lessons by the department's own standards. We should be pursuing competition. When you look at the waiver requirements, it doesn't meet any of them in terms of the justification being made by the department. So I'm continuing to struggle with this idea that while competition's good, almost across the board, we make major exceptions. And we make major exceptions when we know the weapon systems is already over cost significantly, and we don't pursue competition. I need better justification for this from those in procurement that understand it. And so I'd love to hear a reasonable explanation other than just short-term investment in competitive engine. Yeah, it's going to cost more in the short term because you're investing in 2 engines. But the idea is that over the long term, we will improve the competition, we will improve the engine, and we will reduce costs. Help me understand why this exception is being made in this specific case.
Again, in this particular case, I'm going to have to defer to the contracting community. I hear you. Again, it's my understanding of the program that the projected savings would only take place if, in fact, you really had true competition throughout the life of the program. And that apparently is problematic. That may or may not occur. But let me not get into areas that are outside my bailiwick. You've raised some legitimate contractual sorts of questions. I think the best course is let's get back to you. To the extent we haven't provided you some of this information, in my humble view, we should. So, it's I think an issue that needs to be debated and needs to be sorted out.
I believe we need to get back to also the department's argument about the upfront costs being real and concern about the savings, but we should share with you those numbers, and I don't have them off the top of my head, so we will have to get back to you on that.
But is it safe to say that given that the primary contractor is already well over budget, that in the future we might expect them to continue to go over budget? I mean, isn't that a safe assumption? And that the whole idea of cost containment through competition is to disincentivize those cost overruns and to provide the competition so that those costs are held in check.
I would not say that we expect them to have further cost overruns. The cost estimates that we're providing, that we provide for the budget and we're providing here for a Joint Strike Fighter, are our best estimates of the actual occurrence. So I would not expect additional cost growth. One never knows, obviously, but the estimates we are giving are not showing additional cost growth.
But Dr. Spruill, I assume that you would admit that this is a significant exception to the policy of the Department of Defense through procurement to encourage competition in major weapons acquisition.
Right. It was a special consideration by the department to look at the costs and benefits along the business case line that Mr. Sullivan talks about, and the decision was that it was not cost effective, and therefore they're going with a single engine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Not to jump onto your issue on that, but I know 2 things. One, I know we put the cost estimates in thinking they're not going to grow, but we only had $300 billion worth of cost overgrowth in the last report that GAO did, and if we had got the information from the department, we'd know what it was more recently on that.
Could I say something about that?
Sure.
A lot of that cost growth, and Mr. Sullivan and I do have, we arm wrestle over this periodically, that a lot of programs, we have 102 programs in our portfolio. Many of those programs are older programs that did have cost growth since their initial start. However, a lot of them are now performing very well. So to take that number and apply it to the department's acquisition today may be just a little bit overly harsh.
It might, but I remind you again, if we had had the information given to GAO that could give us that assessment of what it was last year, then we would be able to make that kind of measurement on that. And so it's not helpful to us to judge whether or not there's accuracy on that. I know there's good intentions. Can you tell me, Mr. Roth or Dr. Spruill, what happened, what changed between February's budget rollout and now that the Secretary decided to make the alternative engine an issue?
I don't think this is a new issue. We made the same issue when we submitted the FY10 budget as well, and frankly in previous budgets as well. We have not funded an alternate engine for the last 5 or 6 years. The program has lived on congressional ads over the last 5 or 6 years. So the decision was made years ago. This is not a new position on the part of the department at all.
Okay. Let me wrap up just by asking one question about personnel on that. You've recognized it, you seem to be working on that. The rise in contractor work shows a hollowing out of a capacity for management and oversight, which isn't just unique to the Department of Defense, it's Department of State, it's a USAID, it's a lot of agencies down the line. Do you think we're on a glide path to correct that situation? How long do you think it will be before we have the inherently governmental functions back in-house so that when we're looking at a contractor who otherwise wouldn't necessarily have any incentive to be concerned about some of the things that the government, whose money it is, might be concerned about? What's the glide path there?
Well, we have an initiative, as you know, to grow the acquisition workforce by 20,000 folks. Those are insourcing to the department. They will be government folks.
By when?
In the next 5 years, over the fit-up period. And we have already started that in 10, and we have made good progress. I'll quote a number, it's probably wrong, but it was about four, I believe, instead of 4 of the 20 would be in the first year. And so we have been going through the jobs, looking at them, deciding which ones we can insource. Now, some of that we are insourcing from taking contractors that are doing the job today and no longer doing them with contractors. Others we are bringing in new people because, as you know, over the last 10 years we cut the acquisition workforce quite a bit, and we believe we cut it too much. Right. So we have an active initiative. Now, the department is also doing some insourcing beyond the acquisition workforce, but we are definitely looking to bring those inherently governmental functions in and at a reasonable rate. We didn't think we could do 20,000 in a year, so it's over a 5-year period.
Do we have the workforce development capacity to get those people up to where they need to be on their skills and
yes, and we have the
levels?
Defense Acquisition University. We sent over a strategic plan for human capital initiatives and plans for the acquisition workforce. I think it just came over a couple weeks ago, and so we have laid out a process. I happen to be the functional leader for the business portion of the acquisition workforce. That's about 7,000 folks. But we have increased the training requirements and the experience requirements for those folks, and we are moving people into and through that process so that they will be level 3 certified acquisition professionals.
Great, good. Well, thank you all very, very much. I appreciate your testimony here today and your exchange of ideas. People will be submitting questions, I assume, within that 5-day period, if you'd be kind enough to respond to those when you can as well. This is helpful to us, and I appreciate both the progress that's been made in the Department of Defense, the work of the General Accountability Office. So I see a number of people from both of those areas sitting behind. I want to thank them as well for their good work on this. It is good to see people working together in this sense. You take what you can learn from GAO and advise on that, push back on them and arm wrestle with them if you have to to keep in line on that or whatever, but the idea is that with what we've passed and what you've passed in the Department for New Regulations, we have to get a grip on this, and we appreciate the guidance and the work. So thank you all very much. Meeting adjourned.